The Open Window, adapted from a story by Saki. "My aunt will be down soon, Mr. Nuttall," said the confident 15-year-old young lady. Frampton Nuttall tried to think of something to talk about with the girl. He also wondered what he would say to the aunt. At his sister's recommendation, he had come to their home in the country to rest and cure his nerves. But he doubted whether the visit with total strangers was going to help him. "I know how it will be," his sister had said before he left for the country. "You won't speak to anyone down there. Your nerves will be worse than ever from moping. So I'll give you letters of introduction to all the people I know. Some of them are quite nice." Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Sappleton, the girl's aunt, was one of the nice people. "Do you know many of the people here?" asked the niece. She thought that they had been silent long enough. "Hardly anybody," said Frampton. "My sister stayed here 4 years ago. She gave me a letter of introduction to some of the people she met." He said the last sentence unhappily. "Then you don't know about my aunt," continued the self-assured young lady. "Only her name and address," he admitted. He wondered whether Mrs. Sappleton was married or widowed. Something about the room made him believe she was married. "Her great tragedy happened 3 years ago," said the niece. "That would have been a year after your sister was here." "Her tragedy?" asked Frampton. It was hard to imagine tragedies in this restful place. "You may wonder why we keep that window wide open on an October afternoon," said the niece. She pointed out the large French window that opened onto the lawn. "It is quite warm today," said Frampton. "But what does that window have to do with her tragedy?" "Oh, on this day, 3 years ago, her husband, her 2 young brothers, and their little brown dog left through that window to go hunting. They never came back. On the way to their favorite hunting spot, they all drowned. It had been a very wet summer. Places that used to be safe to walk across were not safe. The marsh gave way suddenly without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it." Now the girl's voice softened. "Poor aunt always thinks that they will come back some day. She believes they will walk in that window just like they used to do. That is why the window is kept open every evening until the sun goes down." She continued, "My poor aunt often talks about how her husband went out that day with his white raincoat over his arm, and her youngest brother would sing, 'Birdie, why do you bound?' to annoy her. Do you know, sometimes on still, quiet evenings like this, I almost get a creepy feeling that they will walk in through the window." She stopped with a little shudder. It was a relief to Frampton when the aunt hurried into the room, apologizing for being late. "I hope Vera has been amusing you," she said. "She has been very interesting," said Frampton. "I hope you don't mind the open window," said Mrs. Sappleton. "My husband and brothers will be home soon. They always come in this way. They've been out hunting today. They'll make a muddy mess all over the poor carpets. So like you men, isn't it?" She continued talking about hunting and birds and ducks, but to Frampton it was all purely horrible. He tried hard to change the subject, but his hostess was only partially paying attention to him. Her eyes were looking past him to the open window. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that his visit was on the day of this tragic anniversary. "The doctors agree that I need complete rest. I also need to avoid anything that might excite me too much, and I cannot do difficult exercise," announced Frampton. He mistakenly thought total strangers would be interested in his medical problems. "But the doctors do not agree about my diet," he continued. "No?" said Mrs. Sappleton, in a voice that only replaced a yawn at the last moment. Then she suddenly brightened up, but not at what Frampton was saying. "Here they are at last!" she cried, "just in time for tea. They look as if they're muddy up to their eyes." Frampton shivered slightly and turned towards the niece with a sympathetic look. The child was staring out through the open window with horror in her eyes. In cold shock, Frampton swung around in his seat and looked in the same direction. 3 figures were walking across the lawn towards the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them was wearing a white coat. A tired brown spaniel was at their heels. Noiselessly, they walked towards the house. Then a hoarse young voice sang out, "I said, Bertie, why do you bound?" Frampton grabbed wildly for his stick and hat. He ran out the door, down the gravel drive, and through the front gate. A bicyclist on the road drove into the bushes to avoid hitting him. "Here we are, my dear," said the man in the white raincoat, coming in through the window. "We're fairly muddy, but most of it is dry. Who was that rushed out as we came up?" "Oh, a very unusual man," said Mrs. Sappleton. "He could only talk about his illness, then he rushed off without a word when you arrived. It was as if he had seen a ghost." "Oh, it must have been the spaniel," said the niece calmly. "He told me he was terrified of dogs. A pack of wild dogs once chased him into a cemetery. He had to spend the night in a newly dug grave with the creature snarling above him. That would be enough to make anyone frightened." Wild tales at short notice were her specialty.